So the beautiful thing about this, long story long, is that the nervous system takes blood away from regions that you don't need it, and it makes it available to the regions that you very much need it, which is going to be the skeletal muscle system.
The only way that this system works is if we actually have like another heart in our muscle. So you could almost think of like the heart pumping blood out, but then we have another heart on the venous or return side of our circulation, and these things are constantly cycling blood back and forth to one another.
Something's going to shut you down. I don't know what it's going to be in any particular instance, but you're going to have some perception of some physiological system giving feedback to the brain that's going to make you so uncomfortable that you're not going to want to continue.
Fundamentally, the same three regulatory systems are governing all of those, and maybe how you adapt to those is really just the most logical way to cope with the specific environmental stressor you're giving yourself.
RPE is essentially like your brain taking all of the information coming from literally every combined system of the body, and it's interpreting it, and that is the final output, is what you would think of as how hard this seems to be.
In the people that won the events in all of those track and field distances was not the person with the highest velocity, it's the person who covered the least distance. So even in a sport like track and field, the distance that you run isn't standardized.
We're so obsessed with trying to make our sports competitions natural and pure, but like everything in our life is going in the other direction, that it's like insane.
Because I know the like hip thing in like coaching in the human performance world is like I'm the athlete-centric coach, and like I take in the athlete's feedback and all these different things, and I do think there's importance to that. But at the end of the day, I also think that human perception tells us almost nothing about underlying physiology and limiters.
You're measuring the wrong thing. Your conclusions are actually erroneous. Like you're not aware of what you're actually changing at this point in time. And you're kind of in a delusional state and giving credit in areas where the credit shouldn't go to.
All right, guys, we're back on the podcast. Evan, Pat, it's been a while since we had both of you on, but it's a great pleasure to have you on again. Evan, how have you been?
Been doing pretty well, man. How are you?
Good. And we've been speaking pretty regularly in the last few months, a little bit less with Pat. Pat, how's things?
I'm doing okay. Yeah. Busy, but enjoying life, and excited to be here this morning. That last time was really great. I hadn't, I didn't know Evan before that, and I was just so impressed by both the breadth and the depth of his explanations. It was really just like amazing to be part of that experience. So hopefully the second time is a really good, solid repeat of that first one.
Yeah, I appreciate it, man. It was great chatting with both you guys last time. So I've been excited to get this one going for the past week or two when we started planning this out.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to wrestle or see you guys exchange on a few of the topics. What I've been really interested in right now is everything brain, respiration, breathing, the heart, and muscle, and how all those systems interact. So I thought, what better to do than have both you guys come on here and kind of go back and forth on those different topics. So I'll leave you the floor pretty quickly here. First thing I want to talk about is I think that the brain has to be the most fascinating thing out of all of the ones that I mentioned before. And so again, I don't want to give too much structure here. Maybe Evan, I'll let you start with, how do you see the interaction between the brain and the three other kind of big physiological systems that I mentioned? So if I say brain and heart, what do you think? If I say brain and lungs, what do you think? And then brain and muscle, and maybe give a little bit of a baseline on this. And then Pat, I'll let you go after that same question as well.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, given that you're talking about the relationship between the brain and all of these other systems, like the first thing that comes to my mind is just thinking about like integrated cardiovascular control. So I'm not an expert on the brain. I'm not a neuroscientist. This is going to be very reductionist, but the two big things that I'm thinking about are vagal withdrawal and sympathetic nervous system activity, and how both of those things impact cardiac output and the regulation of blood flow to different areas in the body. So if we're just doing like small muscle mass exercise, we're just like squeezing a hand gripper till failure. It's a really simple task. There's going to be little to no sympathetic nervous system activity ramping up during that activity, and heart rate's probably going to be under 100 beats per minute unless you're really deconditioned. So the flow of blood to those working muscles is more or less going to be inversely proportional to how much you're deoxygenating those tissues. So you start working those muscles, you're stripping oxygen out of the tissues, and then you're going to increase flow in response to that. And that's the process of metabolic vasodilation or hypoxic vasodilation, whatever you want to call that. But once we start getting into like more vigorous exercise, if you're doing like a leg press or cycling or running or CrossFit, anything more complex, that's where sympathetic nervous system activity starts becoming increasingly important. Because if we're thinking about the pumping capacity of the heart, it's finite. It's actually a pretty shitty design. If you look at some of the like super old school exercise physiology textbooks before it was even called exercise physiology, like the work physiology books, they have these like super complex mathematical models basically showing that on paper, like a human being shouldn't be able to stand up, let alone do exercise, because we don't have enough blood in our body, and our heart's not powerful enough to maintain our arterial blood pressure. Like the pumping capacity is just so finite. But what makes all of that possible is that our sympathetic nervous system regulates our blood flow by constricting areas of low metabolic activity that allows us to get blood to more important regions. So when you talk about like the respiratory system in the brain, well, if your respiratory muscles are doing a lot of work, it's a lot more important than a muscle in the periphery like your forearm or your quadricep. So you're going to shunt more blood to those respiratory muscles, and by virtue of that, you have to have less blood in the working muscles. So there are these like inverse relationships between respiratory muscle blood flow and skeletal muscle deoxygenation in the periphery. And that's the big interplay that I'm thinking about with the brain. I'm sure Pat has other things to add to that, but that's kind of like the starting point of like getting into integrated physiology. It's like what impacts blood flow, mechanical factors, metabolic factors, and the sympathetic nervous system. And at any given point, those three things are kind of like tugging on each other, and one of them has to win out.
Pat, you
Yeah,
can
I think
jump right in, man.
that's a great just like analysis and big picture topic heading. You know, just to kind of piggyback off of that, one of the things I've always been impressed by is the timing and sequencing of the way that systems will work together to really maximize utility and output. And, you know, when I think of sympathetics, I also think of the adrenal gland as well. It's kind of like such a tag team. And, you know, in response to exercise, like the most immediate response is going to be this, when we're talking about large scale global exercises, was kind of differentiated from like isolated, very peripheral, small exercise. But bigger exercise, the first thing that's really going to happen is going to be a neural response. And you'll have this sympathetic output that's going to be taking place. And when you look at the, you know, norepinephrine and epinephrine that are going to be excreted sympathetically, they're usually found in a ratio of 80-20 in favor of norepinephrine over epinephrine as they're flowing out from just a purely neural perspective. And when you talk about the differences between norepi and epi, you know, it really comes down to the receptor that they're able to bind to at the level of the, you know, of the vasculature in the periphery. And, you know, when you talk about, there's alpha receptors and there are beta receptors in the periphery for these adrenaline-based compounds. And when you talk about norepinephrine, it's only able to bind to alpha receptors. And really the receptor is what dictates the response of the vasculature. And the alpha receptor is going to create a constriction response. So the primary job that the sympathetic nervous system creates primarily a constriction response. So the first thing that you do is shunt blood from like your reproductive system or your digestive system at the initiation of exercise, which makes a ton of sense. Like you really don't need to be worrying about reproducing when you're running away from a tiger. But you do need to immediately make blood and fluid more available to the peripheral muscles to be able to power you. Now, what I find really interesting is that in a slower sense, we're talking, matter of seconds for the sympathetic nervous system, and possibly a matter of like, up to a minute or minutes when you really get down to the adrenal gland in terms of how powerful it is. But the adrenal gland is going to pump out the same chemicals in norepinephrine and epinephrine, but it does so in the opposite ratio of it being 80% epinephrine over 20% norepinephrine. And epinephrine has this ability to bind to the beta receptors, which are the vasodilation receptors. So the beautiful thing about this, long story long, is that the nervous system takes blood away from regions that you don't need it, and it makes it available to the regions that you very much need it, which is going to be the skeletal muscle system. And then you have this secondary response chemically of bringing this wave of, a large amount of epinephrine to the skeletal muscle, because that's where blood is now being directed. And this very high level of epinephrine will bind to beta receptors and cause a further dilation response, so that we're able to really maximize at that point, with prolonged activity, the ability to fuel those muscles and get more blood and oxygen to those systems. So I've always been impressed by, sequencing on that front. The other thing that I think of when it comes specifically to the cardiac system in the brain is, Darwin had a secondary book, which was like, I can't remember the exact title of it, but it was like, it went into the emotions of animals and their specific postural responses to those emotions and vice versa. But he spent quite a bit of time talking about the cardiac system in there, and basically said that the communication between the brain and the heart is like just so interlinked, it's unbelievable. So that really, like, as your heart rate rises, it's going to be sending such a strong signal to the brain that the brain is going to be interpreting. And, your perceptual experience is going to be so strongly based on your interpretation of this cardiac data. And it's pretty stereotypical for the most part, where we're going to have, increased feelings of panic or fear or anxiety, something along those lines. And, the more that you work with people, the more that you can witness this with exercise, where particularly, you have to desensitize people to this essentially. Like when people begin exercise, they just freak out, like people that are out of shape, because they're not familiar with this kind of environment to exist in. But you ultimately can learn, what it is that it means to exist at that level of intensity with exercise. And I find that like providing other bits of information for the brain are really helpful. And I think that's where basically biofeedback becomes so important, with even being able to display heart rate to someone. So it's like, hey, this is just what 150 beats a minute feels like. Okay. If you didn't see this visually being presented back to you, like you wouldn't be able to interpret it appropriately. But the brain oftentimes needs more information, so that it's like, you're not going to die. This is just what it feels like to be at this level of work. And this is the experience that you'll have when your cardiac system is at this point. So you really almost can't separate the two in terms of the emotional responses of the animal, the arousal, the perception to that arousal. And that communication is so instantaneous, it's pretty incredible.
Evan, you have anything to add? Please go ahead. I'm just listening.
Yeah, so there's so many like interesting strings in there that I just want to like pull on. So going like way back to what Pat had mentioned a little while ago about the circulating epinephrine and norepinephrine, one of the really interesting things about this is that it leads to like one of the great almost like paradoxes in cardiac physiology, where we know these circulating chemicals are going to change the inotropic state of the heart. So basically changing the myocardial contractile state, and it's going to cause more calcium to be dumped into the myocardial cell, and that's going to increase the strength of contraction, and that's going to cause a greater stroke volume as well. So we know what the importance of stroke volume is, but one of the things that becomes so perplexing now is that the strength of contraction dictates the stroke volume. In the end diastolic volume dictates stroke volume, but stroke volume dictates end diastolic volume. So like all these things that Pat's talking about, where we're trying to get blood to the periphery and we need it for doing this work, it becomes such a clusterfuck, because these chemicals are causing us to eject more blood from the heart and get more of the blood to these peripheral tissues. But by virtue of that, less blood is in the heart. So these things become determinants of one another. And this is where we start to get into like other really interesting concepts. Like I know, Sean, you had sent over like a list of some topics that you want to chat about. And this is like the perfect transition into like these muscle pumps, because in order to understand how cardiac output and end diastolic volume, or preload, if you want to call it that, essentially how much blood's in the ventricle before the heart contracts, if those things are determinants of one another, which inherently makes very little sense, we basically need to understand that the heart can't increase its own outflow. Like that just doesn't really work in a closed system. So now that we're getting all of this blood to the periphery and we're vasodilating these tissues, we need to have some kind of adjustment in the peripheral tissues to get blood back to the heart from those vasculature beds, because our arterioles are our primary resistance vessels. So the arterioles could increase their radius and diameter by multiple folds. And if all of that blood were to just pool in our tissues when we're doing exercise, like we would outstrip our cardiac output so quickly and probably fall down and hit our heads and die. So there is like a Darwinian evolution perspective to these things as well, where if this didn't work, we wouldn't be existing right now. And one of the big adjustments to get blood from the periphery back to the heart is that the skeletal muscle pump could force all of that peripheral vascular volume right back. So the only way that this system works is if we actually have like another heart in our muscle. So you could almost think of like the heart pumping blood out, but then we have another heart on the venous or return side of our circulation. And these things are constantly cycling blood back and forth to one another. So like we've kind of started with this small muscle mass exercise, and Pat brought it to full body exercise where you're really pushing your cardiovascular system, and like it's terrifying, it's painful, and you have all these sensations going on. And it's interesting because it almost scales linearly with like the more sensations of fatigue and pain and all these feelings that you're getting, you're also scaling up the complexity of feedback loops and regulation that's going on as well. And I have to believe there's some like causal link between those two things. Like the more you're pushing your body, the more systems you're tapping into to make sure you could keep yourself conscious and functioning. And there is some level of threat inherently in that. So it's just like interesting how all these things kind of tie into one another. And it's just this really complex and dynamic system that we're dealing with.
Yeah, Pat, could you bounce back on that idea of the muscle pump? That's something that I actually learned about recently. Stuart Percival's presentation on the Moxie Summit 2020, I think it was, where he talks at length about the effect of the muscle pump on, like you said, Evan, venous return and preload, and in turn cardiac output. And then something that you've kind of brought to my attention, Evan, is also the thoracic pump or the respiratory pump. And I read that through Dempsey's work as well. And so you essentially have those three pumps. You have the heart, and then you have the muscle that pushes it back. And you also have that thoracic respiratory aspect with the changes in volume and pressure between the intra-abdominal, intrathoracic cavities, and that all kind of plays together in that loop of circulation. So Pat, if you could maybe bounce on that.
Sure. I mean, it's, veins do not have smooth muscle. They're called the capacitance vessels. Like at rest, we're all sitting here, 65% of our total blood volume is in our venous system right now. And that's a significant amount. Veins just stretch, and they can't actively pump blood in a direction. They need assistance on that front, either pressure coming from the arterial side pushing into them, or your own skeletal muscles contracting. And when skeletal muscles contract, they basically squeeze on the veins and they push blood, kind of like pushing on a tube of toothpaste, in the direction of going back towards the heart. I think you only need to reach 40% VO2 max in order to maximize skeletal muscle pump. So it's not like we're talking like a enormous amount of output, and anything further than that is really like not counterproductive. Although I suppose it could be when you talk about occlusion, to the point where you're not allowing blood to leave. But, like usually when I think of the skeletal muscle pump, I'm thinking about it from the perspective of utility being like recovery exercise, where it's like, this is one of the reasons why light aerobic exercise is so effective consistently from a promotion of recovery standpoint, because you're just simply going to be, yeah, I think if you've just got this blood sitting in the veins, just kind of, it's literally just sitting there like stagnant water or something. You have to get it moving again. So do something, and it doesn't need to be too hard, but just can create this contraction of skeletal muscle next to the veins and to literally squeeze on it and send it back. Now, the respiratory pump, I'm not as familiar with, but I would imagine it probably is from the oscillation of the diaphragm moving back and forth, and probably how it would affect both smaller vessels, but I would imagine almost like the abdominal, like the vena cava as it's approaching higher levels, just providing a similar sort of a compressive phenomenon on it to be able to promote. I would imagine it's like, when I think about this kind of stuff, like I think about it, there's an inverse relationship between velocity and the number of beds in the vascular system. So like, for instance, at the level of the capillaries, that's the most number of beds. Like you just have so many capillary vessels in the body. They're the smallest vessels, and the velocity of blood is the slowest there. So, as you get to the aorta or the vena cava, those are the fastest velocities of blood traveling through there. So they need a little bit less in the way of assistance. So I don't know as much about the particular topic of a respiratory pump, but so I don't know the magnitude of something like that, because I would imagine you already have like relatively higher velocities at the level of the vena cava. So return from that point might not be as much of an issue, but certainly at the level of the venules, you'll have a significant amount of stretching there and blood just sort of sitting there, which will need kind of promotion from an external source of contraction to be able to get it moving. And then once it's moving, it's probably able to move quite a bit on its own momentum as more comes behind it and continues that push. But I'd have to look more into that to have anything worthwhile to tell you about a thoracic or a respiratory pump.
Yeah, and I mean, Pat literally nailed it. Like, even just going on first principles, like you had said, oh, I'm not familiar with the respiratory pump, and then you perfectly explained it. So there you go. And that's exactly, it's basically when you deepen inspiration, you lower your intrathoracic pressure, and that increases the pressure gradient between the right atrium and then where the inferior vena cava enters the thoracic cavity. And that deepening inspiration also raises the intra-abdominal pressure. So it basically just creates a larger pressure gradient between the abdomen and the thorax. But what makes it kind of confusing is some textbooks, like, they explain the respiratory pump, and then some say there's an abdominal pump and a respiratory pump, and they act independent of each other and with one another. So it just seems like the whole body of literature on abdominal and respiratory pumps like aren't completely understood or entirely fleshed out. So it's hard to have like a deep consensus or understand like all of the practical applications or implementations, because the literature is just like not really there yet.
Yeah, for me, what's interesting with those ideas, like you said, even if maybe it's not as clear cut in the literature yet regarding the thoracic pump, for me, when we talked, aerobic work, light, easy, long duration, for me, what stuck in my mind from reading Joel Jamieson and others was really that kind of 120 to 145 to 150 heart rate, because that's where you could get the most stretching of the left ventricle, the most filling, and then because of physics, you get that eccentric hypertrophy. And now adding those concepts on of continuous blood flow through an effective muscle pump, like you said, Pat, you don't have to be at a very high percentage of MVC or of VO2 for this to happen. And so if you can have an efficient venous return, optimized venous return, that is going to increase preload, and then that's going to have a bigger effect on the heart than if you go potentially at higher intensities, meaning there's less time for the ventricle to fill. There's maybe more potential, like Pat mentioned, more potential for occlusions at the muscle, which would impede venous return, maybe more chances for respiration to get out of whack as well at higher intensities. All things pointing back to, again, that LSD work definitely has its place, especially if you're looking to improve that whole system of circulation and potentially that eccentric hypertrophy of the left ventricle.
On that front of that eccentric hypertrophy, like I remember listening to a presentation Carl Valley did a few years back, and him just talking about like having worked with a pretty high level athlete and really trying to promote that, and just like getting basically no return on investment from it, and sort of like questioning like how much of a change you can get with adults. Like that may, you might have to do like 8 hours a day or something like that to really get anything from that, versus like where it's probably most prominent would be in childhood, where kids are supposed to just be playing like all day, every day at a low intensity. And that's where you can really maximize it. Mm-hmm. So I hadn't, it's not an area that I really go into in depth in terms of the examination that I put into it, but I wasn't sure if either of you had heard much on that front, that it was a fairly, it wasn't a particularly plastic response that you can get in adults.
Yeah, and I'd actually heard that same thing from Carl as well. It might have been at the same talk, it might have been a different one, but I had also talked to Aaron Davis, who I know both you guys know about this like years back as well. And at the time, I was like talking to him, and I was like pretty hyped on these like eccentric cardiac hypertrophy protocols. And he's like, well, you probably can get some eccentric cardiac hypertrophy, but you're probably going to need to put in somewhere in the order of magnitude of like 2,000 hours of low-level aerobic work per year, where you can do that. But it's like, is your goal just to change the morphology of the ventricles in your heart, or is your goal to get better at a sport? If it's to get better at a sport, like probably don't chase that morphological adaptation. Like you'll get the outcome of it with way less volume. So it's one of those things where in theory, like it makes sense that there would be left ventricular hypertrophy, but it just doesn't look like there's that much evidence of it. At the end of the day, like if you're getting the outcome that you want, does it really matter if the morphology is changing? Not that anyone even measures it anyway. So
So what's the primary mechanism, let's say, to increase blood flow and maybe the pumping capacity of the heart itself? What might be the things that allow us to have a more efficient pump, a more efficient heart to work with from a performance standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think about is just like, well, how many orders of magnitude could your cardiac output change? It's relatively small. How much could the radius of your blood vessels change? Quite a bit. And because radius is raised to the fourth power, every little bit that you raise your blood vessels radius is going to increase blood to a tissue exponentially. So for me, I'm always trying to think about, well, we know vasodilator capacity could outstrip cardiac output, and we know some of the metabolites that increase radius. So I think it's more of a factor of have the ability to release the metabolites that expand radius. And typically people could do that if they're not in a disease state, like someone with like ARDS or peripheral vascular disease, they can't do that very well. Most people are capable of that. But then you need to improve the maximal pumping capacity of the heart so they're not being quote unquote governed, and they could actually do that. And I mean, it's no wonder why stroke volume and cardiac output make out 90% of differences in VO2 max between intermediate and advanced athletes. If your heart has a greater pumping capacity, then you are able to maintain a greater radius in your blood vessels. So it's almost like these two systems are acting on one another, and the big stopgap is what your cardiac output is. So you only need to raise that to the extent that it allows your brain to not pump the brakes and allow you to deliver that blood to the tissue.
Yeah, to kind of echo that, I think that, going way back to like studies like McCardle at Queens College on kind of early specificity studies of taking people, VO2 max testing them on a treadmill, training them in a pool for like 6 weeks of vigorous training, and then putting them back on the treadmill and witnessing no improvement in treadmill performance, despite the fact that, blood volume increased and a number of other typical markers of improving the aerobic system. The conclusion was that they didn't train the running muscles in the fashion of running to improve in fitness. So the rate limiting factor was that the muscles, the nature of kind of a stretch shortening cycle and a ballistic output of the muscles was not trained. So they're not able to utilize any alterations in the central system when they're trying to perform the task that they're going for. And it kind of harkens back to what Evan just mentioned in terms of talking to Aaron Davis and sort of like, hey, if you want to get better at the sport, you better play the sport kind of a deal, where you really need to be able to get more efficient with the specific motions that you're going to be doing that matter for you. And it might be that the physiology behind that is, I mean, it is purely local changes that are going to be taking place, whether that is, increased local mitochondrial biogenesis or some improvement in local metabolite production at the level of the arterioles that are feeding the capillary beds for those particular muscles, or just new capillarization development at those points, adaptively, just from a protein synthesis of capillary bed laying down perspective. So it's going to be more in the way of local changes. And I think also just as was mentioned, like the conversation back and forth between the brain and the heart in terms of getting used to being uncomfortable in those places and promoting more output. Because most of the time, like, the driver of adaptation is going to be an increase in volume. So you can't increase volume if your brain is tapping you out. So you need to have progressive overload in order to have an increase in adaptive change over time. It's just, where is the adaptation taking place? And it's probably, for most of the time, especially as you're approaching in season or very important events, it's probably going to be largely local, but it doesn't mean that the central factors can't promote the local adaptations. Like, you really need that. Like, sometimes you won't be seeing your central system's output reaching its maximum because, I mean, this we're really kind of getting into the discussion that's going to revolve around RPE, but something's going to shut you down. I don't know what it's going to be in any particular instance, but you're going to have some perception of some physiological system giving feedback to the brain that's going to make you so uncomfortable that you're not going to want to continue. And when that happens, you'll probably cease continuing, or you can potentially override it, but it's usually overridden through an emotional response that when you get into kind of discussions on recovery and overtraining and things of that nature, a lot of times it's when you reach these points of like needing significant emotional arousal that kind of grinds you into the dirt, and where people take a long time to recover and can't recover. So I'm always looking to promote like progressive increases in volume for specific tasks that don't necessitate really needing to tap into like high levels of emotional arousal. So I think that's where, like, featuring that as a factor in this, because this whole discussion is based around kind of like brain, cardiac system, respiratory system, and skeletal muscle system. To me, this is a big part of it. Understanding like kind of the divided nature of the brain and the emotional elements of it. And look, like, all of these parts are going to be, when you talk about like that which is going to be controlling the sympathetic nervous system, it's kind of like we got hypothalamus controlling pituitary, but then what talks to and feeds into the hypothalamus? And the answer to that is like, well, basically everything. But your emotional system is always going to be looking to hijack your hypothalamus, whether that's amygdaloid or some other region. But it's kind of like that stress of really needing to send this increased drive to the hypothalamus for increased output at that level. And I don't think we know the physiology at that point, but it just seems, either anecdotally or through, repeated demonstrations, the more you try to fire yourself up and really like push yourself emotionally through these things is when you really get into this overtraining or problematic injuries are going to rise. Everything that can go wrong usually goes wrong. The more you have to rely on very high levels of emotional arousal and drive to power you through these things. So, I could probably keep going, but I think that gets the main points across there.
And I don't know why this is where my brain starts going, because as Pat's talking about this, I'm thinking about like different types of training where all of these factors become relevant. And like some of the things that are like floating through my mind are like Pat's mass protocol and like how fucking terrible that is, and like CrossFit, and then like bodybuilding. And what's really interesting is like on paper, these are kind of like a stepwise bridge to one another. You have like bodybuilding, and then you have mass in the middle, and then you have CrossFit. And it's like a gradient of how much you're fucking with your cardiovascular control mechanisms. And then if we were to keep going down that spectrum, eventually you're going to end up with endurance sports. And it makes me start to wonder if, for all of the different ways that you could interfere with your cardiovascular control mechanisms, if the adaptations that you get to each of those activities just makes you less likely to die from that specific insult. So if you're doing like bodybuilding training and you're creating a lot of localized tissue stress and hypoxia, and there's not a lot of vagal withdrawal, it's like, well, if you're continually getting bombarded with that environmental stress, like the best way to probably deal with it is to add more tissue. And if you're doing CrossFit, like the best way to deal with that specific insult that you're being slammed with over and over again is to get whatever adaptations you get from CrossFit. Who even knows what those are, really? And we need to like keep upping the volume and the RPE to keep getting continual adaptations, because if I keep giving you this insult, eventually you'll adapt enough that that specific stimulus isn't interfering with your cardiovascular control. So you bump the RPE up, you bump the volume, and you keep getting that adaptation. But it's just interesting to me to think about it from that perspective, because when we're doing like bodybuilding training, like I've never thought about cardiovascular control when I'm doing a set of bicep curls. Like it's never floated my mind. But in that way, I think these topics that we're talking about today are, in a sense, a bridge between all of these different disciplines in training. Like whether you're trying to get like jacked as all hell, or you're trying to run a marathon as fast as you possibly can, fundamentally, the same three regulatory systems are governing all of those. And maybe how you adapt to those is really just the most logical way to cope with the specific environmental stressor you're giving yourself. And I think I actually got this from Pat like years ago, not even talking to you, listening to maybe you talking to Robbie or something, the idea of training as an environmental stressor that you need to cope with. And maybe you were talking about like polyvagal theory or something along those lines. But I remember that being like a big kind of light bulb moment for me. And it's kind of permeated my thinking in a lot of ways over the years.
You know, I'll for sure let Evan's statement stand alone, because I think it was well and thoroughly explained, and it just like, to me, it kind of goes to the discussion that is surrounding RPE as a total topic in a lot of ways. And when you get into that area, it's kind of like what's the signal to noise ratio, so to speak. And with certain kinds of exercises, there's a very clear signal with it. Like, and I would say that probably two easy to pick out ones would be like pure strength training. Like if you're doing a 1 rep max deadlift, or like long, slow, steady state aerobics. Like it's kind of like a very kind of clear, pure energy system or output sort of a thing. So there's not as many systems, and I like the word that you used there, Evan, insulted. Like there's just like one system that's really being like called upon to power you to a, you know, there's always a mix, but in this case, it's about as close as we can get to like, I can pretty much guarantee that with this deadlift, it's like, I think it's going to be the muscular system that's going to crap out. Okay. When it comes to the long, slow, steady state aerobic kind of a thing, I'm pretty sure it's going to be the aerobic system that's going to crap out, as long as people are trained, so to speak. But when it comes to CrossFit, I have no idea what system is going to be the one that makes you crap out. But I do know that in all three cases, you're probably going to crap out at a point where you hit an RPE of 10. All right. It's just that what is actually driving the RPE at any point in time. And so it's that like RPE is essentially like your brain taking all of the information coming from literally every combined system of the body, and it's interpreting it. And that is the final output, is what you would think of as how hard this seems to be. The cool thing, when you kind of go back to the old literature and the old experiments and the creation of RPE from Borg, is that they made the scale 6 to 20, because if you just put a 0 after whatever number the person says, it's unbelievably predictive of their heart rate. So, but they were doing, you know, a typical graded aerobic testing procedures in a laboratory. So that makes sense. Like, you're probably going to be primarily targeting with a very clear signal the aerobic system. But I guarantee you, if you were to somehow be able to RPE someone during a CrossFit metabolic WOD, you probably wouldn't get that much of a clear-cut heart rate response. Like, different WODs would probably create different heart rate correspondences with their RPE. You might have a lower heart rate with something that's incredibly locally fatiguing, and the person's at a 10 out of 10 RPE. So it ultimately makes it where the more mixed the sport, the more difficult it is to kind of target and train the fitness qualities for that particular endeavor. You know, I've got a client he's an older guy now, but he was a pretty high level cyclist when he was younger. And so he's like very cycling metrics driven, you know, like he has a pretty cool home gym setup, but he doesn't understand a lot of like the ideas that I have in regards to metrics for resistance training. You know, he's like, when are we going to do like watts per kilogram or something like that? And I'm like, well, it doesn't matter for what we're trying to accomplish right now. Like, that's an irrelevant thing. Like, he's like, but we could add so many other data points. And I'm like, we don't need all these data points. Like, we have the right number of data points for what we're trying to accomplish for your current goals. Adding more to that is just unnecessary in a lot of ways. But that's a bit of a sidetrack. But the point of it is that with cycling, it's a very closed system. You know, it's like the pedal goes around one time, and there's a defined distance that you travel for a specific gear. So it's kind of like force and distance are accounted for with a bike. Of course, it changes with hills and grades and wind and everything else. But on a flat track, one time around at a specific gear, it's a very fixed thing. And typically, like for an ergometer with cycling, to be able to test people, it's a very controlled system. So you're going to be able to have some very clear, definable, like you can predict who's going to win the Tour de France pretty easily based on laboratory measures. Because the design of a bike is so uniform. When it comes to trying to predict performance in other activities or other sports, there is never going to be that helpful of like a singular, clear, defined variable, because so many different things can impact ultimately RPE. You know, I think like Marcori's work on RPE come from Italy. I think it's like the biopsychosocial, you know, model of endurance performance. He's really trying to get across this notion that for endurance performance, we need to simultaneously witness appropriate levels of essentially kind of like your biometrics need to be in a good place, but your external output variables need to be going in the right direction from a training standpoint. But simultaneously, we need to be monitoring your RPE at those levels. Like, I could witness someone making appropriate internal adaptations, but they haven't trained their perceptual qualities enough on that front to be able to essentially, there's been plenty of times where you've seen high-level athletes that should have their physiology in a place where they should win, and they've bonked in their performances because they haven't trained their mind and their RPE levels appropriately. So featuring both of those as a tracked, measurable entity is really essential at this point for endurance training. And I would just say that when it comes to these other mixed areas, it's going to be more muddied, you know, like if it's powerlifting or if it's like Tour de France cycling, it's actually it's an easier thing. in some ways. CrossFit is just this, the word that's coming to mind is contaminated. It's not the right word. I'm not trying to put this negative spin on it, but you have no idea what you're interpreting because there's so many systems that are being affected that are sending their threat message to the brain, and literally any of those messages could shut you down. Like it could be that you just got the worst callus ripped off your hand in your life, and that's the signal that's going to your brain that sends you from what should be a 6 RPE up to a 9.5. And that has nothing to do with your cardiac output or your cross-sectional area of your quad or the degree to which you occlude your veins, but then it could feed into that perceptually, the way that all these things can integrate and have feed forward and feedback mechanisms. So that's just kind of where the overall topic there just spun me.
Yeah, and I think CrossFit's interesting that it opens the door to have a mismatch between perceived exertion and where you actually are on a true exertion scale. And makes me think of like there's two ways that you could mismatch it. You could experience something out, like let's say 10 out of 10 RPE is your true physiologic limit. You experience a 7 out of 10 as a 10 out of 10, which means you have a lot of room for improvement. But if you truly hit that 10 out of 10 or you go above it, like that's where you really fuck up the system. And there are experiments where they get people to do that by mismatching. Like in Marcus Amon's lab, I don't even know how they get like IRB approval for doing these with an ethics board, but they basically take like undergrad students and they put fentanyl in their spines and they make it so they can't feel pain in their legs, and they have them do cycling tests to exhaustion. And the people like go out at like an 100% effort because they don't feel pain, and they just like grind themselves into a nub to the extent that they like lose the ability to stand up because they've created so much disruption in the lower limbs. I know Pat knows him too, like James Serby. I think he was actually on some of those papers and experiments, and they've just done some like insane shit where you're like, okay, that's a clear mismatch in the opposite direction. And you never see that in CrossFit. Like a lot of times in CrossFit, people they're objectively nowhere near failure. Like they're not going to fail a rep of a burpee, but they just stop moving. And like, you can't will these people to do more work, and they're nowhere near true failure. So I think because there are so many fatigue inputs, it mismatches them in the other direction. Where if you think about like a more traditional test of work capacity, like it's not uncommon that when you watch elite cross country, people mismatch it in the other direction where they black out 10, 15 feet in front of the finish line. Like they'll just be running and you just see them go like, oh, lights out, and just like face plant in front of the finish line and not get up. And that's never happened at the CrossFit Games, which essentially tells us like these physiological insults are insulting enough and plentiful enough that it's causing people to misinterpret where they actually are in relation to their true physiologic limits. So even when we talk about like physiologic limiters in CrossFit, it's like, well, yeah, maybe we're seeing signs that your respiratory system's not coping with this, or your cardiovascular system, your muscular system. But at the end of the day, you haven't actually exhausted any of your limiters to the extent that you can't really even go anymore. So there is this psychological component to it. And like, I don't have an answer for how to remediate that. Like I try and fix the physiology as much as I can, improve performance. They could just bump that up. But I think even as we're getting these people fitter over time, they're probably still capping it at like a 7 to 8 out of 10 on a true exertion scale. And that's something that's kind of interesting, because if you could get someone to like truly go to the brink in a CrossFit Metcon, they might like it's possible that Matt Frazier could just go farther, closer to his 10 out of 10. Like objectively, all of his lab values might be the same as the number 2, 3, and 4 CrossFit Games athletes. And I have physiologic data on, I think 6 out of 10 of the top 10 male CrossFit Games competitors over the past 2 years. They're all pretty much identical, yet they have this large distribution. So I'm inclined to think that what actually separates them in these Metcons is more to do with how close they could get to their true exertional limit, versus that like one of their respiratory systems works 20% better than the other guy. Like there's morphological limitations to what your respiratory system could do. So it's not like this guy could develop his to a greater capacity. Like it's pretty fixed based on your body size.
Yeah, Pat, I'll let you bounce that in a second. One thing that comes to mind when you say this, Evan, is Matt in one of his recent interviews talking about, when he's deep into an interval session on the rower, he's going to do some math there because he feels like that's going to be the determining factor in a competition setting when the pressure's on, when he's at the end of his rope and he has to make a quick decision or decide whether he goes for another rep or not. And it all comes back to what's going on inside the brain. Another example that comes to mind is one of the few interviews that I was able to find with Ilya Ilin, who won a really big number of medals in Olympic weightlifting for Kazakhstan. And when he was talking about the Olympic record or the world record that he set, I forget which one it was, he was saying that moment of stepping onto the platform and putting chalk on his hands and gripping the bar and listening to the crowd, he had lived this moment in his mind thousands of times before. He had played it over and over. Talk about obviously visualization and the mental side of things. And so when he stepped on that platform, it wasn't anything new. He was home. He had already been there so much. He knew what the bar would feel like. He knew what the lights were going to look like in the room, the sound of the crowd. And so for him, it was like literally just another lift. And maybe that's where we see those people at the top of their respective disciplines kind of displaying that beyond the fact that they're absolute savages on the physical side, but really the determining factor is actually what's between your 2 ears.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just think I would be very curious, and it goes completely against CrossFit, but if CrossFit standardized their events, like for a couple of years, like the CrossFit Games will stay these same exact events.
Mm-hmm.
So you actually knew exactly what to train for. And because it's almost like, let's say you're just in regular training, even bodybuilding or something like that. You go through a training block, an 8-week block or something like that. You keep your exercises the same. And then you switch to another block, week 1, even if you're trying really hard, I guarantee you're going to beat week 1's numbers with new exercises in week 2. Even if you went to a 10 out of 10 RPE in week 1, because it's just that it's novel enough. And you could be talking about going from, barbell, dumbbell, or barbell incline press to dumbbell incline press. It's just different enough where your system is still learning, and if your system is trying to figure it out, there's no way your system can really go to the max. Like it has to be so prepared for every element that it's exactly what you're talking about, Sean. Like you've been there, you've done this before, and it's like everything is accounted for. Now it's really just a true expression of your physiology just doing the most that it possibly can, rather than being sidetracked by some other input of whatever it is, novelty, or you tied your shoes too tight. Like you've literally made every mistake prior to this moment so that you know how to account for all of those things. They don't take place on the most important day. And it's like you're just running on autopilot as opposed to having to think about anything. If you have to think about anything or account for anything, you're not going to be able to maximize physiology. Like all of these, advanced human thought, like prefrontal cortex things need to go completely into the backdrop so that the hindbrain can just maximize what it does in power motor output to the highest degree it possibly can. Otherwise, there's competing energy resources taking place as you're trying to problem solve for novel problems the day of. And, it's almost like, for the most part, sports follow a trajectory of going from not standardized in like really ancient times of a sport to much more standardized and objective and defined rules and characteristics. I mean, it's the amount of preparation that goes into mature sports is insane. Like if you were to go to an NFL practice, like catches that guys used to make that people would go gaga over in 1993, where they tap their 2 feet on toes on the sideline before going out of bounds. Everybody does that. Kids in high school do that now. Like it's trained. People practice that stuff. When I was up and coming in baseball, like robbing a home run was a big deal. And now it's like kids practice the right mechanics on how to rob a home run over the wall when they're in middle school. You know, they know how to like hit the wall the right way with footwork, look down, look up, find the warning track, find the wall, find the ball, hit the wall the right way, get your armpit over the wall, bring it back in. It's like, it's so standardized and choreographed, and you don't have to think about it. You just respond to it. So it's like that which used to be superhuman is now like, you know, par for the course for high school kids. And that's kind of just the evolution of these things. But if you look at super mature sports, typically, you know, like I just think of like the oldest things you can possibly think of, like running against other humans in races. Like it's the only thing that's going to make people go faster significantly is if you change the surface of the track, or you give them new shoes or something like that that have like a significant output difference. Because I bet you know, if you take Jesse Owens, you bring him back, you train him in modern equipment with modern track surfaces, he's going to run with anybody. You know what I mean? It would be like if you had to have sprinters run on different surfaces from the history of sprinting, and they didn't know which surface they were going to run on any given day, and you had separate world records for different track surfaces, I bet you guys would struggle to break records a hell of a lot more than they do now, because they know the standardized track surface. There's so many things that get standardized that you wouldn't think of as things mature that end up making this huge difference. But yeah, if you took the modern 100-meter Olympic race and you didn't tell them, and you're like, guys, actually this year you're going to be digging your own blocks with this little spade, and you're going to be running on this like kind of like mixed dirt and rock formation, guys would be like, what's happening? Like you'd have an unpredictable winner. You'd have like times that would be all over the place, as opposed to, I guarantee, like for the most part, analysts that really know what they're talking about can probably tell you who's going to win, who's going to come in 10th, and within like very close margins be able to tell you exactly what their times are going to be in the Olympic finals.
Yeah, and I think what's so interesting about that is past maybe like the 1960s, the fastest times in most track and field events really haven't improved. And like Pat said, a lot of the innovations have been modern track surfaces, and it has been shoes that have better energy return and improve economy. And what you see is at the edges of performance, that hasn't changed. But what it looks like is people could get to their true maximum potential in a much faster period. And I think most modern training innovations just makes it so you could reach your potential quicker, but it doesn't necessarily change what your top end potential is. So now you see high school runners running like a 3:55 mile, and you're like, it's always the same thing. Oh, this kid's going to be like the next greatest miler in the world. It's going to be incredible. But then they just never get faster again. Like they peak out when they're 16 years old and they never make a single other improvement. And that's one of the really interesting things. And it starts to get into like the idea of what the purpose of sports are in general, because at some point you're like, man, for us to just keep making better athletes and to make this more interesting, like you're going to have to legalize the pharmacological component of it. And you're also going to have to allow for a little bit more technological innovation, and like that's going to be part of the sport as well. And that raises a lot of like weird ethical and philosophical issues. But at the end of the day, what's kind of interesting is if you actually look at the history of like track and field and weightlifting and a lot of these sports, up until like the 1930s or 1940s, it was like a black eye if you did not use pharmacological enhancement. Like it was a sign that you weren't actually committed to your sport if you weren't taking drugs to compete in it. And now it's like such a backward thing because it's become so like highly moralized. So it's just like an interesting way to think about human performance. I don't even know how we got on this topic, but going back to the CrossFit thing, like I honestly wouldn't be surprised if you took the top 10 guys at the CrossFit Games and they haven't actually gotten fitter over the past 5 years. They're just kind of like throwing down year to year and like rolling the dice and seeing who best copes with the demands. But I think you're absolutely right. By virtue of them changing the events every year, there's no bar to jump over. You see it all the time in open workouts. No matter how hard a games athlete hits an open workout their first time doing it, they could repeat it a day later and do better. They could repeat it a day later and do better again. I've seen games athletes hit the same open workout 3 times in a weekend and get better every single time, even as fatigue is accumulating. So if that's the case, like, what makes us think that people are working at their maximal capacity at the games every year. And how much better would people be if it was the same 10 events every single year, like a mixed modal decathlon? But I think that's just so opposed to like the ideals of the sport and like what draws people to it in the first place. But I think that would be interesting. Like if you're claiming that the person that wins the games is the fittest human being, like you have to standardize it, because otherwise you're just making a bunch of tests up and you're saying who's the best at coping with this arbitrary set of skills. And the person that wins every year, like Matt Frazier, might just be really good at managing cognitive load. And he might not actually be fitter than Noah Olson or whoever comes in third. He might just be better at managing cognitive oversight. So are you testing for the person who's the fittest, or like the person who's really fit but also has like a larger prefrontal cortex and can make decisions under fatigue? Like it's two different sets of skills.
CrossFit's really weird when you really get down to it. When you really examine it and think about it, it's just like, it's not actually fitness. It's just measuring coping capabilities to novel, physical challenges in a lot of ways that are becoming more and more sort of standardized over time. Like you kind of have a general idea of like what each event is sort of going to be. So there's a bit of that, but there's still enough weird things thrown in there that are like, wait, what am I doing? Huh? How does this work? So it's you're always going to kind of get that. So the other thing that I just think of when it comes to CrossFit is you're always going to just figure out who the best guy is compared to other guys, but probably shorter than the other guys, or like shorter limbs or something. Like the smallest amount of displacement per unit rep is probably going to be the thing that matters a significant amount, because they have to do so many hundreds and thousands of repetitions. So like the rower is a great equalizer. You know what I mean? I don't know enough about CrossFit. I don't follow it particularly. So I don't see like, hey, this guy's really amazing at this thing, but not as good at the rower. But a rower, it's like if you're a taller athlete, it's measuring your work. It's actually measuring the work that you're doing, as opposed to barbell movements are just measuring the load. It would be, the rower, if it was just number of strokes that you performed on a rower, irrespective of the distance that it went, you'd probably see different people winning on the rower. First guy to 1,000 strokes on the rower wins. And it's like, okay, the shortest guy that's in good shape is going to win. And it would be like inherently obvious. And it's like, well, that's not a very good competition. That's kind of a dumb challenge. But we're doing the same thing with the barbell movements. And it's like the more reps you do, the shorter you are, the more of an advantage you have on that front. And when I think of CrossFit, it's like, hey, do a bunch of reps with a barbell that moves through whatever distance it is that you move the barbell through space. And if I move the thing, 3-4 inches less distance per rep than another person, and we're doing 500 reps across the span of a 3-day period, if you added that up, it's like, well, you did like a quarter mile less work than that person and you won. It doesn't really make any damn sense.
What's so funny about this is like that is exaggerated to the nth degree in CrossFit. Like if you work equated CrossFit and you said like who actually did the most work in these Metcons, I could almost assure you that it's not Matt Frazier. It's probably not also any of the guys in the top 5, because they all more or less have the exact same anthropometrics. But it's interesting because the same thing actually happens in track and field too. So there's a really great analysis from the Sydney Olympics where they took the top 10 people, and I think it was the 800 meter, the 1500 and the 5K on the track, and they took their rank order, but they also looked at their average velocity, and the person that held the highest average velocity on almost all of those events was not always the person that won the event, where you're like, how the hell does that work? So everyone ran 1500 meters, you had a higher average velocity than everyone else running 1500 meters, and you took 4th place in the Olympics. And you're like, well, the reason for that is that also measured displacements in the people that won the events in all of those track and field distances was not the person with the highest velocity, it's the person who covered the least distance. So even in a sport like track and field, the distance that you run isn't standardized, because depending on, your tactics, like if you ran, everyone runs at like separately. So like you run in the first lane and do your run, then you finish, then I go, it would be a different rank order than everyone running together. So it's just like an issue of sports in general, but CrossFit blows that out of proportion to such a high degree. And I remember having an athlete that I worked with years ago. I had him do 100 strict handstand push-ups for time, and he did it in like 3.5 or 4 minutes. I was like, what the fuck? Like, how does that work? And you watch him, yeah, his arms are so small that he's literally going. You're like, oh, so if you do any workout with strict handstand push-ups, your range of motion is 3.5 inches. If I do it, I've like, in climbing, there's a measurement called an ape index. It's basically how long your wingspan is relative to your height. Like I have a ridiculous ape index climbing because I have monkey arms. So like if I go and do handstand push-ups, like 5 of his reps might be the same amount of work as one of my reps. So if that was the one event in the CrossFit Games and he beat me, is he fitter or is he better suited to that specific task? Technically, I do more work. He does it in slower amount of time. So I think it's fundamentally also just a flaw in, if you reframe CrossFit as not who is the fittest man on earth, it's who is the best at doing these arbitrary tasks. Like it's 100% spot on, but the fact that they claim fittest person on earth is just kind of like asinine, because the person that wins the event might not even be the fittest person in that competition. It could be the person in 25th place if you actually equate work density.
Yeah, and I guess you also have you have to be the smallest, have the smallest frame possible, or the smallest segments possible that allow you for the least distance travel for a given exercise, while still having the frame necessary to withstand the loads that maybe bigger humans will be able to sustain. And then that comes to mind from the you guys can probably help me here.
Sorry about the fire truck.
Oh, we can barely hear it. It's kind of canceled
okay,
out.
all right.
Thank you, Zoom autocorrect audio. In weightlifting,
Glad you guys can barely hear it. I can't hear anything with that damn thing.
In weightlifting, how relative to body weight, the smaller people can lift more weight than the super heavies, because you have that it's a non-linear relationship between cross-sectional muscle area and then the size of the muscle itself. And so you compound that with the fact that a smaller person is going to have to travel less distance for, say, a thruster. They're also going to be at an advantage from a muscular standpoint and a work standpoint. It's a Sinclair scale. That's what I wanted to get to. When you equate lifts on the Sinclair scale as a weightlifter, that way you can compare the lightweights and the super heavies. So you have that aspect of I guess the way that maximum force production is determined through cross-sectional area, but the fact that growing a bigger muscle is different than on a smaller frame too.
Okay, so I'm inventing 2 sports now. Both of them are extremely stupid sports, but they're both going to be very fair. One of them is a allometrically scaled version of CrossFit. So we're going to put like a metabolic gas analyzer on you for every event and like some muscle oxygen sensors, and we're going to measure your displacement, and we're going to have you do Metcons, and we're going to scale everything based on how far blood needs to travel through your arteries and veins and all of these things, and we're going to figure out who does the most work. So it's a fair version of CrossFit. The other sport that I'm more interested in is going to be kind of like CrossFit. You could take whatever drugs you want and you could equip your body with whatever biotech you want. So if you could make yourself like an exoskeleton, it's fair game on the strongman event. If you could put like springs on your feet for the mile run event, like it's fair game. And I say this jokingly, but I've actually had this conversation with a few people in the past year that I actually want to invent this sport. And there's a version of this, I think it was in Zurich a few years ago, where they had people and they put them in exoskeleton suits and they raced around the city. And like the coolest thing ever. And it was a ridiculous prize purse for it. So I know Pat and I are both in the Northeast, kind of around the New England period. Sean will ship you over here in a year from now, and we're going to throw down on insane events, and you could build whatever you want in the interim period. We're going to make another podcast out of this when COVID's done.
I mean, it's literally just human evolution when you really get down to it. Like humans interacting with pharmacological agents and trying to build things to have more power and output. That's what we do as an animal. You know what I mean? So we might as well just run with it from a sports standpoint. We're so obsessed with trying to make our sports competitions natural and pure, but like everything in our life is going in the other direction, that it's like insane. I don't even get me started down this rabbit hole, actually, because it's just going to lead to, just pointing out insane hypocrisies that might even get me in trouble. But yeah, it's interesting to me how much we delude ourselves into thinking that we're advancing in certain areas, where in fact we're not advancing in the ways that we think we are. It's like, oh my God, we're getting faster as a species. Look at the times in track and field. We're getting better at making better surfaces and shoes. Okay. We're getting stronger as a species. Look at, like powerlifting numbers over time. Well, we're getting better at delivering drugs to humans and making gear for powerlifting that you can, have like squat briefs and other things. It's kind of like, are we really getting better at creating training systems? Are we getting better at training technique? Are we getting, like, what are we getting better at? Like, I'm always just curious, like, can we identify what we're getting better at? Because that's a really important thing. And I think that that's one of the most common errors that I see people making from a thought process standpoint in terms of what their analysis is revealing to them. I'm like, you're measuring the wrong thing. Your conclusions are actually erroneous. Like, you're not aware of what you're actually changing at this point in time. And you're kind of in a delusional state and giving credit in areas where the credit shouldn't go to, which, look, like, if that's what helps you go to sleep at night, fine. But I'm much more interested in, like, peeling back layers of the onion that gets you to truth. Like, and it's a very difficult thing to arrive at. And most of the time people are just completely unaware that they're even, like, creating like a misnomer of credit for where they label it.
Yeah, that's that. I guess we have 5 minutes on the clock, so we'll wrap up on that. But just piggybacking on what you just said, Evan, you've been talking a lot recently about obviously listening to the athlete for their feedback where it's warranted, but then trying to be very clear on what you're trying to measure as outcomes, and can you actually attribute any change to a given training protocol, and why can you draw those conclusions in a fair way, maybe using a bit more data and some of the tech that you've been using recently, right, Evan?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And it's one of those weird things, because I know the like hip thing and like coaching in the human performance world is like, I'm the athlete-centric coach, and like I take in the athlete's feedback and all these different things. And I do think there's importance to that. But at the end of the day, I also think that human perception tells us almost nothing about underlying physiology and limiters. And I would love to talk about this more in the next few months once we could publish this data, because it's unpublished right now, so I could only explain so much. But we have pretty complex mathematical models using physiologic measurements in live time that allow you to predict time to exhaustion in like a mixed pace and mixed terrain activity within like 2 to 3 seconds accuracy. So if I was like, hey, Pat, if I get enough data on you, I'm going to have you run a 5K in the woods near my house, I could tell you the fastest way to pace that to get you there. And if you start going too fast, I'll be able to tell you you're going to fail in 8 minutes and 26 seconds. And we have that within a pretty high degree of accuracy, and people's perceptions don't really get you there. And in a way, it's a weird place to be as someone that works with athletes, because it makes a lot of sports deterministic. I think the utility of sports like CrossFit is that they're not deterministic, because you're never going to be able to conceivably collect enough data to make those calculations that robust. Like it takes a lot of work to be able to model even someone running that accurately. So the idea of doing it with CrossFit and the amount of money you would need to spend to do that, it's unreasonable. So I think we almost need to like think about what the role of sports are in general. Like, what is their utility in society? What are we trying to get out of them? Because at the end of the day, like, most of the improvements in performance are coming through tech. People aren't happy with that. Once tech gets too good, it gets outlawed. Like Nike recently made a shoe with a 4% energy return. People have been saying shoes could do that for decades. They actually did it, and the shoe got banned. So at this point, like if you've basically outlawed improving playing surfaces in footwear and running, have we hit the ceiling for performance at this point? Or are you incentivizing people to cheat and get like the one way that they could improve performance pharmacologically? So I think right now is like a weird precipice where sports are in a very weird place, and you need to kind of decide like what arbitrary rules you're going to work with. And I don't know, it's going to be exciting to see what happens with all these things.
Yeah. So I just think that it's overall the discussion today. I think you never know exactly what direction it's going to go in, but I think it was very cool where, you know, we kind of started talking about physiology. And I think that oftentimes what happens is this realization of how maybe poorly we understand physiology still at this point in time. And it's kind of like, once you think you understand something, it's almost impossible to really begin to understand the interaction ramifications and the way that they just confound what you previously thought you really understood. And what I found fascinating is like that, Evan, you're working with a team that created a mathematical modeling for someone running in mixed terrain. And, you know, I would imagine in some ways that it was not, correct me if I'm wrong, but it probably wasn't super physiologically focused in some ways.
Yeah, that's exactly it. The physiologic variability, if you were to try and do it entirely off of physiology, is so large that you just need to get enough data with all these moving pieces to basically create a linear regression model that just says like, what are all the degrees of freedom? And then you could model it. But you're right, like it works and we still don't understand why it works.
And, you know, that's kind of where I've sort of been at from a thought process standpoint for a little while now, which is kind of, you know, I think it's made me less interested in learning about physiology over the last few years, because I think I've found that in some ways the value, the feedback from learning more physiology doesn't really improve what it is that I'm trying to accomplish in either my own training or in other people's training. But finding better ways to be able to measure and analyze things, that to me is really like where I find the greatest value at this point in time. Like essentially, can I get more accurate in measuring the external output that is being created and really get close to being able to measure that kind of stuff? And I have the advantage of, you know, working with a software team here in New York City, and we've got some pretty cool stuff that's like coming down the pipe that I get to play around with. But literally, especially for strength training, none of it is based on analyzing what's happening inside your body while you're doing these things. It's just like, hey, what's the load? How far did it go? How fast did it move? And with that, you're able to really standardize training. And you're able to actually get a sense of whether or not the person is improving or not. And what I found you know, you were kind of going into this athlete-centric concept of a coach. And it's like, well, yeah, I'm kind of athlete-centric because I care about what you're doing. Mm-hmm. But listen, like when you come in and train, this is what we're going to do. And if you're not executing and you're not going in the right direction, it's like, hey, what's up with you? Why did you not improve? And now we begin to kind of unpeel this person's behaviors and life characteristics, and you find out all the things that they're doing that are sabotaging themselves. Because, like, for the most part, like, you know, people are not putting all of the elements together to really give themselves an opportunity to express themselves to the highest degree. You know, have they checked off their box in terms of really managing food appropriately and fueling their performance? Chances are probably, you know, mediocre at best. Are they really keeping their lifestyle at a stress level that's appropriate for them? No, they've got 6 different things going on that are kind of taking them away. And are they controlling sleep? Are they maximizing that particular thing? there's a lot of factors, you know, that really, once you begin to dig into someone's life, like as human beings, we are just, you know, we're the glaring things that we have in our lives that are holding us back are usually fairly obvious, but people don't tell you about them right away. But if you have evidence that like their data isn't moving in the direction that's appropriate, you begin to find out why. And it's usually the same problems that every person has. No matter how much you think somebody has their life together, you dig in there a little bit, you get to know them as a person, and you're like, oh, you're just as much of a mess as I am. I just didn't realize it. I thought you really had your shit together. And then if you just kind of help people, you know, figure their stuff out and make these major whole-scale changes to these large glaring things, you tend to really help them as a person. And when you help them as a person, they begin to just put more things in order that push them towards their goal. And it's just very rare that you get this, you know, this golden glowing person that you're training that just literally has everything figured out. And so it's more like, I've always thought of data collection as being important for how you use it to aid people in what's going to really assist them in, you know, being able to regulate different parts of their life and factors that go into that they can make enormous changes and switch things in a direction that's amazing. And ultimately their ceiling is going to be their ceiling, but there's probably 20 different things that are low-hanging fruit that you can strip away from them that have, you know, more to do with getting to know them as a person and figuring out these giant problematic repetitive behaviors and habits, as opposed to some kind of minutia that we think of as probably being athlete-centric coaching. Mm-hmm. So that's just, you know, like something that I think swirls in my head a lot, that's hard to necessarily get to in a relevant way in a typical podcast conversation. But I do feel like we transitioned to it really nicely with where we went to today. So, you know, I hope we get to do this again, and maybe it won't be as long before the next one. We're on kind of like an annual cycle here, which is, you know, kind of, it's fun in some ways, but we should do a biannual cycle as a next progressive step.
I like that. It's official, so it will happen before the end of the year again. And just for people listening, and maybe the next big things for you guys, Evan, what are you working on right now? What can people find you? And then same question for Pat.
Yeah, so right now, just primarily working on some research, trying to get some papers published so I could kind of put out some of these ideas that we're talking about today. Place to find me, only social media I use is Instagram. So again, I recently found out that is not a blogging platform and it's intended for pictures. So I've been keeping like a content blog on there. It's not the right medium, but that's where I am.
Awesome. How about you, Pat?
I do the same thing, man. I just made Instagram a one-stop shop. Like that Linktree thing is fantastic. Anything I'm working on or product that will be available, I just put it on there. You know, the thing that I've got that is next in line for me to put out is that I have kind of finished all the things that would be a Rethinking the Big Patterns online platform. So what I'm planning on doing with that entire Rethinking the Big Patterns area of what I work on is that I'm creating it into a certification model. So people would be able to go to this online platform, and there's, I think, like 12 online lectures that have corresponding quizzes that go along with them. Once people go through all that material and pass all those quizzes, then they're kind of admitted to being able to go to in-person seminars. So there'll be 3 different recurring in-person seminars that are going to be more hands-on and application-based. And once people have done those seminars, to be able to go back to the online platform and take a cumulative final exam that'll be pulled from the book that I wrote for it, as well as the in-person seminar information. So if they finish and pass this final exam, they'll be certified through the system. But it's ultimately me trying to create a really robust certification that actually means something, where it's like, hey, if you pass this thing, I bet you've actually put a lot of hours of time in. And I do think that it's a fairly high utility demonstration. Like if you want to hire someone and they've actually passed this certification, this person probably knows what they're doing from the standpoint of coaching and understanding how to fit pieces together. So I'm excited about that coming up. But as always, I'm working on about 10 different things at the same time. And I don't know if I'm coming or going most days. But I do love doing these kinds of discussions because I feel like it just gets me back into kind of like these really high-level thought trenches that I feel like I want to spend more time in, but ultimately get pulled away from with sort of like random bullshit that becomes day-to-day task-oriented things that are sort of low-tier energy draws or drains that just drive you crazy, I feel like, as you get older. But this is what I truly love is these high-level intellectual discussions on fitness and what things really mean.
Yeah, well, both of you guys, thank you so much for coming back on. It was a great, great pleasure again. And like you said, Pat, we will do this rather sooner than later, for sure, before the end of the year, if not maybe this summer. Maybe we'll have to ramp up the rate of those a little bit, because honestly, just listening to both you guys go on those different topics is always a real eye opener for me. I always learn so much, and I'm always going on somewhere on a tangent, thinking about something, and having both you guys just kind of recenter everything. I'm like, oh yeah, shit, maybe I should, rethink this a little bit, just, perspectives. And it's always very enriching. So thanks so much, guys.
Yeah. Thanks
Thank
again.
you.
Guys. It was a pleasure.
All right. See you soon.
Later.
All right, guys. Pleasure.